So today we're going to be looking at a story in Matthew chapter 15 in particular. Um, but we're going to use that story and use it as our starting point to be able to come to an understanding of some of these religious traditions around purification, specifically in the Old Testament. And many of these traditions had symbolic implications. They weren't merely just physical, literal rituals, though they had that. They were also symbolic. They're very symbolic, and so we're going to use those to be able to explore this idea of how external acts cannot merely rectify the inner complexities and the inner moral struggles. And it's a story that has much relevance to today. It has much relevance throughout all of time, and there might be some that think perhaps some of these ancient rituals around purification and cleansing may not have any implication today. But I challenge that with the idea that many of these rituals had very, very important symbolic implications for our psychological and spiritual well-being. And so, we get to the story in Matthew chapter 15, and it starts with some of the Pharisees and the teachers of the religious law now arrived to see Jesus. And they asked him, "Why do your disciples disobey our age old tradition? For they ignore our tradition of ceremonial hand washing before they eat." And so you can already tell in some ways, what Jesus is going to reply, because the emphasis for these religious teachers and these Pharisees has become that of the age old tradition, not what the tradition was meant to symbolize, but the tradition in and of itself. And so you can kind of get the idea that Jesus's reply is going to be a challenge to the tradition and a focus on the higher moral application of what these things were supposed to represent. And so Jesus replied, "And why do you by your traditions, violate the direct commandments of God?" And so there you have it. It's this contrast between two ideologies, if you will. The commandments of God are seen as the highest moral calling, and that's there's a lot of discussion and argument as to where morality came from, and there are some that argue that morality came from God, and you have no other way of you really have no other way of putting it. And some perhaps in the more postmodernist sense, and maybe Foucault types would say that morality is relative, and that there is no sense of morality, and it's constructs. And you know you can you can argue that, and I think it's not something that we'll do today, but you'll see it in this dialogue between the religious teachers and Jesus, that um, there is this conflict between the two: the commandments of God, the highest moral calling, or the traditions of man, and their attempt at moral cleansing, if you will. And I think it's a very relevant topic in today's world. Whether conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat, individuals try or attempt to make themselves morally clean by doing and performing certain acts that make them feel as if they are morally clean. And the idea that you'll find in this story here, as we continue, kind of just going past a little bit more to kind of get to the crux of the matter, is that Jesus says to them, their worship is a farce, for they teach man-made ideas as commands of God. And so, again, man-made ideas of moral purity, or God's commanded ideals of moral purity. And he continues to say, well, listen and try to understand. It's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you. You are defiled by that which comes from outside of you. And he goes on to say, what are some of those things that come from inside of you? And he says, evil thoughts, murder, adultery, immorality, theft, lying, and slander. And it's something that is very interesting in the West today, because there is this attempt to clean ourselves of our moral impurity by putting some of these religious rituals. And I could give you some examples, especially in the West here in Canada. There is this, attempt, especially at the governmental level, and in schools now, public schools, private schools, a lot of schools and universities, um, have this disclaimer in before they do any sort of meeting and presentation. And they say, well, we want to recognize we're the on this ancestral land of and such native tribe. And what is happening there is part of this moral cleansing that societally we're trying to attain to by saying, you know, we are going to perform this external act as a way of trying to demonstrate how impure we feel as to what has taken place in the past. And you could argue that in some ways, and saying whether that's good or bad, and that's not necessarily what we're talking about today, but more just trying to focus on some of these areas. And you can think about it from a conservative standpoint too. Conservatives will place high emphasis on particular acts as a way of showing your, your moral superior allegiance. And you can think of what some of these may be, and whether it's topics of abortion and things of that nature, and what your stance is. And taking particular stands will show us how clean you are morally. And so individuals attempt this, um, whether it's not buying certain things from big outlets, or being vegan for the sake of animals. And there's this attempt in the human nature to make ourselves morally clean. And there's a lot of emphasis, especially in the schooling system, and something that is very much taught in the West today, is that it's the systems that are what defile individuals. And so we must break down these systems that are the ones that defile. And what happens there is that you're teaching individuals that defilement is not something that comes from within, but it's something that comes from without. And what you end up having is a very similar thing as to what is happening here in the story with these religious rulers, or if you will, or Pharisees. Is that they think that be performing external acts and emphasizing the external will, in some ways, fix the issues that are internal to humans. And you know I think when you think about some of these things, and this is an easy one to bring to the attention, but Marxism, I don't think that all the individuals who read the writing of Marx, and many of these things were these very um, immoral individuals. I think they thought that if they put systems into place, that they could fix the problems of human suffering and evil and violence and many of these things. But the reality of the matter is that in and of itself, it also brought those things, because it is not what comes into you that defiles you, is what comes out of you. And that's the idea that Jesus is talking about. But to get to that, to get to the core of understanding of that, you have to look at these old ancient um, purification laws. And one of the ways to understand them, and you'll find them in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and they can be quite confusing to modern people, and they can seem so unnecessary. And there's many of them. Um, and I'll give you an example. See, in the Old Testament, you were not allowed to go into the tabernacle or into the temple to worship God if you had been in contact with these three items. And it's a easy way of remembering it: dirt, disease, and decay. Dirt, disease, and decay. So, for example, the priests had to wash their hands and wash their feet before they came into the sanctuary. If you touched a dead animal or a dead person, if you touched any dead animal or any person someone in your family did that, you could not go into the tabernacle to worship God for a week. If you had any feces, infectious disease, hemorrhage, so that any part of your body that was producing blood or pus, you couldn't go into the sanctuary to worship God. And that didn't mean that you were shunned by God. It just meant that you could not enter into the presence of God. And there were some to do with food as well. And that enters into a whole other level of conversation, these clean and unclean foods, which were understood to be established much before many of these Levitical laws, because you can read in the story of Noah how some of these animals were considered clean and unclean. But in particular, shellfish, they were not allowed to eat. And we know today that without refrigeration, shellfish is very prone to disease and infection. So, in other words, if you had any relationship with dirt, disease, and decay, you could not go in to worship God. Um, and one way of remembering it or conceptualizing it is that in the Old Testament, the worshiper had a the same relationship to dirt, disease, and decay as does a doctor going into surgery. You'll never see, for example, a doctor going from an autopsy and to go do brain surgery from there. He would have to go through the rites of purification, and he would have to clean himself, and he has to um, put all levels of protection on himself to be able to perform any type of surgery or other things, right? And so, you know, the question is why? What was the point of these laws? What were they trying to teach? Because you'll find that um, many of these things in the Old Testament were symbolic ways of trying to teach moral lessons, and they weren't just symbolic. I mean, um, there was real reasons for many of these things, and in fact, we know today that washing our hands is a good thing. It's practiced quite a lot today. And so you have to understand that what Jesus was saying was not that washing your hands was not important. He was just trying to emphasize the biggest importance because that had been brought down. And so there are three ways to understand how dirt, disease, and decay defile us and defile the body. And so the first way is understanding that it alienates you. It alienates you. And this is true. I mean, you can see what happened during COVID, in which, and not just COVID, I mean, we see this all the time, but this is a, a good way of realizing is that disease, COVID, for example, isolated you. You had to go into isolation before you could have contact with someone else, right? And it's the same thing with it's the same thing with many of these other things like dirt, right? And you can have the most empathetic individual in the world, but if you find yourself dealing with someone that has been on the streets, you will notice that one of the things that keeps you as a barrier from getting so close is the filth. It's the dirt, the urine, smell, and many of these things that they isolate those individuals from other individuals. And we know this because we try to help some of these people on the streets, some of these homeless people or other people, to be able to be made clean. And I have experienced this experientially, where individuals that I have dealt with have felt that once they were able to take a shower and find themselves clean, that they felt better about themselves, and they felt more comfortable being approached. And so we know this to be not just symbolically true, but we know this to be literally true. And it's the same thing with people with infectious disease, right? And so what was this trying to symbolize? Well, the point of these rites of purification and these laws of clean and unclean were supposed to symbolize how sin, conceptualized as a disease, will isolate the individual from God, and it will isolate the individual from the highest moral calling. And so that was part of the symbolic understanding. of these laws. And it's interesting. One of the things that I found out is that if you don't keep your clothes clean, dirt gets into it and it actually wears out the fabric much quicker. The dirt creates friction with the fabric and it pulls the fabric apart. And so what is trying to be explained by these laws of purification is that we are unclean through our um, internal ambitions. And our internal ambitions, sin, it stains us. And it's interesting if you think about the story of Macbeth, Shakespeare, that you have this scene in where Lady Macbeth is has responsible for this murder, and she has this nightmare and she's sleepwalking, and she's struggling with trying to remove this stain, this blood stain that is on her hands. And she says, "There's nothing that can remove the stain that is from my hands." And she's not talking about literal blood because that can be washed away, but it's symbolic of this psychological and moral failing that seems like nothing can make one clean. And that's exactly what Jesus was trying to get at. And this is our struggle today in the modern world, is that we do things to try to make ourselves clean, whether it's donating to certain causes. And of course you can donate to certain causes without having there to be this desire to be made clean, as long as the intrinsic motivations are the ones that are leading, then you don't have to worry about that per se. But for most of us, including myself, there is this desire to make ourselves clean by performing ritualistic acts. And whether that is not purchasing certain things, and I'm not saying that if you would like to do that there's anything wrong with that. But what we must understand is that there is nothing that you can do to make yourself morally clean. And that's what we see in society today. It's this desire to make the individual morally clean by putting in certain laws in the workplace, or you can't say this and you can't say that, and if you say this and if you think this way, you are unclean. And sometimes we read these things in the ancient texts and we think they have no relevance for us today, but they teach very, very deep um, psychological messages. And so when we come to the realization that there is nothing as individuals that we could do to make ourselves clean, then it puts us in this position where we pursue the moral calling of God and what that can provide as the focus, instead of putting a focus on what I can do physically to make myself clean. We focus on some of these moral messages. And I'm not just saying that that's all it is, that it's all just moral messages, but there is real great lessons to be found in understanding these symbolic rituals.